To a lot of my audience, I'm sure the question of what is better between Gen 1 and Gen 3 Kanto is probably going to be obvious. I mean, how could Red and Blue possibly be worse than Firered and Leafgreen with how much more polished they are? Well, you may be surprised at certain perspectives. I kind of held back on this subject for a little while since I wasn't sure how long a video like this needed to be compared to other stuff I have planned later this year. So I decided to keep this brief and finally let out some of my thoughts on how the two games compare. I mean, I'm always one to enjoy a good Pokemon rambling. But before we start, you guys know the routine. I'm streaming on Twitch again, Luna's World, Lo-Fi Hip Hop, telling a story, y'all get it. With that, let's go. Let's start with one of the first categories most Pokemon fans think of, the battle mechanics. Gen 3 is often labeled as sort of a reboot in some ways for the series, and I think it's most felt in the game's mechanics. While the main series hasn't changed the basic premise of being a turn-based RPG revolving around a team of creatures, Firered and Leafgreen is far more balanced than Red, Blue, and Yellow. The newly introduced ability system gave certain Pokemon a certain chance at life that may not have been as good as before, or at the very least, improved already decent Pokemon that could have used an extra boost. Like Gyarados, who was fine in Gen 1, but definitely felt like something was missing. On top of all of this, there is just the fact that you have way more moves available to you. Are you a Charmander fan? Well, that Steel Claw is actually pretty good for the single player experience against Brock, an infamously annoying battle if you had chosen it as your starter. And it wouldn't surprise me if Charizard fans thought of this change first between the two versions, because Gen 1 Charizard, as we've established in another video, kinda sucks compared to its Gen 3 counterpart. And again, that's because of the really lacking movesets in Red, Blue, and Yellow. While Fire type is a lost cause in the original games, it was already improved by Gold, Silver, and Crystal. And in Gen 3, it's an example of how a typing finally felt like it had Fire type move options on par with something like the normal, which had a wide variety of strong attacking options in Gen 1. It's things like this among the new IV system, abilities, and carrying over some stuff from Gen 2 like the special split that Firered and Leafgreen wins in the battle system for a broad audience. That being said, I think it's better to still appreciate the experimental nature of Red and Blue's battle mechanics. The way speed works, the overpowered normal and psychic types, Hyper being weird and not needing the charge after a KO, and if you're into competitive, the roster of top tiers is really fun in my opinion. Unless you're factoring in Mewtwo, who is fun from a world building point of view, but was even more unbalanced than in later games when you factor in the lack of a special split. But that's why I think it's important to appreciate these games for what they were, even with the existence of some good remakes, since you are unlikely to see some of these unique circumstances again. Let's change course here with our comparison. Let's talk about the audio-visual presentation. I think this is where the things are less cut and dry, as art direction is usually a more subjective topic. The aesthetic of Red, Blue, and Yellow, from its towns to its Pokemon sprites, are iconic. Gen 1 also has so many versions between the Japanese Red and Green, the American Red and Blue, and eventually Yellow, which all have different front sprites of the Pokemon. The Red, Green, and Blue version sprites are sometimes mocked for being off-model, but I actually think some of it is a lot more interesting to look at than many fans give it credit for. Some of the art decisions are definitely intentional, and it was kind of cool that Pokemon wasn't afraid to make something genuinely ugly or weird sometimes. Of course, some of it is definitely just unintentionally off-model compared to official art, like some of the older Charizard sprites. That being said, Firered and Leafgreen is once again more broadly appealing to most people. Like, if you show someone with no experience with the series the two games side by side, they're probably gonna pick the remakes. But I can't say for sure that the remakes are the ideal look for Kanto. A part of this is how iconic the original games are, but also, it's kind of safe? One of the criticisms of the remakes back when they were first released is that they didn't really improve on the graphics of Ruby and Sapphire. And I think this is mostly valid, but I think it kind of misses the point. It's not that it isn't improved on a technical level, it's more that it's too similar to those games in art direction, specifically for the areas and color choices. The one noticeable difference I can think of is that some of the overworld sprites are a bit more round looking than in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. While there is nothing quite like the way Gen 1 looks and feels, Firered and Leafgreen undeniably borrow from Hoenn's color scheme. Even on the old dimmer screen of the original GBA model from 2001, Ruby and Sapphire always looked a bit saturated and colorful. This worked for the more tropical Hoenn setting and set it apart from the more limited Game Boy Color games. But the Kanto remakes don't stray away from this style much, so it makes the region feel a bit too similar to Hoenn. Obviously, changing things up dramatically could have eaten up precious development time, but it was always obvious that the games could have used just a slight visual tweak to make it feel a little different from RSC, even if it was just the colors being a little different in certain areas. If the game had a day and night cycle, I think this would have been less of a complaint back then. But it was never implemented in Gen 3, so this was also a factor for the visuals being a bit samey at times. In Gen 4, we'd visit Kanto yet again thanks to the Johto remakes. And even though it's running in the same engine as DPP, I think Kanto in those games manages to visually differentiate itself a little more than the other regions in that generation thanks to the additional detail in the roads, the day and night cycle, and generally better hardware to work with, even if some 3D elements in those games don't always look the best. In the end, I don't think it's appropriate for me to say that one is outright better than the other visually. I think Firered and Leafgreen gets the on-model and status quo look of the series more right by a long shot. But I can't really ignore Gen 1's unique flair and its old-fashionedness. It's kind of like comparing an NES game to its SNES sequel visually. There is artistic comparisons to be made, but if both were good in their approach in their own way, then it's better to accept them as they are, and that they're just going to be different than to articulate it as some sort of measuring stick contest. Of course, we need to talk about the sound next. There are a lot of games with great sounding music on the GBA, but it's still a bit infamous for sounding a bit weak next to the 16-bit consoles from a decade prior that it's often compared to. Firered and Leafgreen doesn't really add anything new to the soundtrack of Kanto, though we do get some Johto music in the postgame. It does, however, still use the sound front of RSC. This is a double-edged sword, as the sound front is quite different, but it also feels like it was intended for the compositions we heard in Hoenn. It doesn't sound bad at all with the Kanto soundtrack, but it doesn't quite have the same oomph as the original Gen 1 versions with a few tracks. It doesn't help that by the time these remakes came out, the music from the originals, as they were on the Game Boy, were already iconic. Still, you are valid if you prefer the remake's music, but personally, I think music like the gym battle track sound catchier on the original. And lastly, there's, well, the content itself. Let's just be blunt. The remakes have more of it. Red, Blue, and Yellow allowed you to continue after you became champion, which at the time was really cool for an RPG to do. Your game didn't just end in limbo right before the final boss like a bunch of other JRPGs, but it didn't really let you do too much for post-game content. Just the Cerulean Cave and trying to finish up your Pokédex. It was nice, but Firered and Leafgreen gives you a real post-game with the Sevi Islands. The problem is most people don't like these islands. They're not super fun. Better than nothing is the best thing you can say. It does link the game with Hoenn a bit more, therefore giving you an in-universe excuse to be able to trade with players from RSC. But, it's just not as cool as the post-game stuff in most other Pokemon games. Not to mention, there isn't much reference to the neighboring Johto region. Only a few very minor things like eluding the silver once. You would think they would do a bit more with the world building in this regard, if they were going to add things in subtle ways. But it feels like they dropped the ball here. There's also little things, like Moltres not being in Victory Road, but in Mount Ember instead. This suits it better, but it may make Victory Road feel a little less special to some, especially if you actually wanted to use it against the Elite Four. There's also just more Pokemon, not just through trading, but also the Sevi Islands. You can also finally evolve Pokemon like Golbat and the Crobat in the postgame, which infamously doesn't actually work until you become champion with no in-game explanation. There's also stuff like the VS Seeker to rematch trainers, which would have been nice in Gen 1, since you basically run out of trainers in the overworld to battle, leaving the game's world feeling like it's in a state of eerie limbo. Firered and Leafgreen are definitely the more complete games, on top of being more approachable with its better movesets and balance. And I think that makes it easy to conclude as better in a technical sense. They're tasteful remakes. However, in mainstream culture, it was never able to quite replace the original. Ask most about Pokemon games in a way that implies you're referring to Kanto, and they're almost certainly going to be thinking about Red and Blue, not Firered and Leafgreen. These games came out after the initial Pokemon boom period, so it's not surprising. But Firered and Leafgreen does essentially replace Red, Blue, and Yellow for many, and the core game's continuity following Gen 3 would continue to reference the remakes, such as using Red's Gen 3 design rather than his slightly different Gen 1 attire. And mechanically, if you like the remakes, you're probably very unlikely to feel like ever returning to the Gen 1 games. Hence why these remakes feel like they were intended to replace the originals. This is kind of like what happened to the original Resident Evil, which had a remake as early as 2002 for the GameCube. It was a very faithful remake despite a drastic change in art direction, and it ended up being so acclaimed that the original 1996 game is now rarely brought up in conversations among current fans unless it's in a historical context. Something you wouldn't really say with the Firered and Leafgreen versus Red, Blue, and Yellow comparison. Resident Evil 2 got a remake in 2019, and this would go in a different direction, being faithful, yet different enough to feel like it wasn't outright meant to replace the original 1998 game. Pokemon doesn't really have any remakes like that, and I think it would be interesting if they did try their hand at reimagining certain titles in a unique way if they are so intent on returning to them, even if it ends up feeling more like a spin-off. The closest we got to that with the core games was Let's Go, which was fun but not too ambitious. But yeah, even though I think it's actually more important to play the original Gen 1 games if you really want to know the context of how Pokemon felt in the 90s boom period, Firered and Leafgreen are generally better, especially mechanically. There are some things here and there that are cooler and memorable in the original games, but Firered and Leafgreen are just much easier to play while being very faithful to what the original Kanto games were all about. And those are my brief thoughts on the comparison between these two games. These were Game Freak's first time remaking a Pokemon title, and it is a pretty tall task to remake something as insurmountably iconic as Pokemon Red and Blue. So I could only imagine the pressure, but I think they did an overall admirable job with it. But what do you think? Do you prefer the Gen 1 games in spite of certain quality of life changes? How would you rank the Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh remakes? Let me know down below.